Consider supporting this podcast on Patreon. On this episode of the What is Asia podcast, I interview Carl Gabrielson, a Ph.D. candidate at the University of California in Santa Barbara and an academic consultant for the Yokosuka Council for Asian Pacific Studies, to talk about his research on the history of U.S. military presence in Japan and the social dynamics created between U.S. military bases and Japanese society. Carl, thanks for coming on this episode of the What is Asia podcast.
Oh, thanks so much for having me. I'm excited to be here.
So you are covering a topic that we haven't really touched upon in any form in this series so far. You're talking about U.S. military bases in Japan. And for people who aren't that familiar with this topic, can you just start by giving people a cursory overview of the history and background of U.S. military presence in Japan? What were the causes that led to this, and just sort of how do we get to this point? And then if you could then tie that into how does your research fit into this?
Absolutely. So at the end of the Asia-Pacific War, of World War II, the U.S. was occupying Japan once Japan had surrendered. And it was unknown how long they would need to occupy Japan. There were ideas about democratizing it, about breaking apart the business conglomerates that had supported the war, about like revamping the whole education system so that it wouldn't be so jingoistic. And so they projected that it could be a decade or more even. And so they started building what they assumed would be permanent or semi-permanent encampments within Japan. And then it so happened that they were able to end the occupation much sooner than they originally projected. But at the same time, the Cold War was just starting to heat up, and heat up, I guess, is the wrong word. The Cold War was taking shape, and in particular, China had its communist revolution, which the US perceived as a threat, and then found that having troops stationed in Japan, there's my cat, was extremely strategic. And so what they did was they made a deal with the Japanese government that they would officially end the occupation and restore sovereignty to Japan, but that they would also maintain a permanent military presence there. And ostensibly this was for the protection of Japan, because under the occupation, Japan had ratified a new American-produced constitution saying that Japan would never again fight in a war or hold a military. So part of the compromise to this was that the US would then stay in Japan, in part as a defensive force, but also as a forward base for keeping communism from spreading, was a big part of the idea. And it was definitely used for that ostensibly. Here's my cat again. Or it was used for that heavily in the Vietnam War and the Korean War. The bases have persisted in part because it's a strong bit of military logic that once you have something, you never let it go. But also because it has been largely beneficial to Japan to be able to invest less in defense and more in its own internal economic development. The US has wanted to stay, and Japan has found some benefit in the US staying. And so it has managed to last all this time. At present, there are about 50,000 US troops and another 50,000 dependents, civilian employees, and other Americans associated with those troops and with the Department of Defense.
Can you talk a little bit about how your research fits into this story of the US presence in Japan?
Absolutely. So we started there occupying what had been an enemy nation. And now, since the 1950s, we've been there as an ally. And it's meant to be a partnership between two nations. So uh, at the very macro level, I'm interested in this idea of what does it mean to have what's meant to be an equal partnership, but where one country gets to post its military might within the other country, and in fact sometimes uses that for leverage in its dealings with that country's government. Uh, on the more micro level, we are putting these tens of thousands of Americans. I guess this isn't really micro, but we're putting these tens of thousands of Americans in daily contact with Japanese people and Japanese culture, but through a military context. And in fact, the military is involved in training all of those troops and civilians for how to survive in Japanese culture and how to communicate with Japanese people. So what brought me into it was this idea that the military has a hand in deciding how Americans and Japanese relate to each other and communicate with each other, and wondering what kind of influence that has, given that the military's goals are military goals and are therefore not necessarily the goals of peace and friendship between people.
So you talk about an interesting contradiction here that I want to get into. So at one point in your research, you write that one aspect of the dichotomy between US military bases in Japan is that bases in Japan, quote, reinforce differences between Japan and the US, between mainland Japan and Okinawa, between troops and civilians, between the bases and their surrounding communities. This seems contradictory because then you write, quote, my project interrogates the relationships between the base-generated binaries and the everyday encroachments that illustrate the permeability of the very categories and spaces those binaries seek to separate. So you're essentially talking about this melding of almost two cultures, the US military base and the outside Japanese world. There's a lot of overlap between them, but at the same time, these bases seem to be trying to separate them. So there's a contradiction here. What's going on there?
So I think it's a large part of it is the military trying to have its cake and eat it too. There's a lot of work put into making the bases feel like America. They're designed to look something like an American suburb. They have shopping centers and bowling alleys and American fast food restaurants, and they show American movies at the same time they come out in the States. So there's a lot of work being put into making it feel easy and comfortable to the Americans who are going to be there. And between that and the restrictions on entry, there's a lot of talk about the base being America and outside of the base being Japan. And people will just casually refer to it that way, including the Japanese people who work on the bases and live around them. So on the one hand, there's this idea of a very clear separation. And when you get into the cultural education programs, I've observed several at a variety of bases across Japan and looked through their materials and things. And there's a lot of emphasis on how different Japan is and how much work it takes to get used to Japan. But at the same time, these people are in Japan every day, and they're encountering Japan in ways outside of what they've been taught and seeing things that contradict what they're taught. And as much as they may want to feel like they're in America, it's so clear that they're not, because everything that's American is kind of a poor facsimile of American life. And if they want to go out to a bar, it's going to be a bar that is in Japan. And if they want to meet people off base, they're largely going to be Japanese people. So there's this sense on the one hand of the cultural education should clearly delineate, oh, this is America, we're in America, Japan is so different, and make that feel really comfortable. This idea that you're not in a foreign country when you're on base, you're still in America. But at the same time, wanting them to go out and enjoy Japan and interact with Japan and be part of Japanese people, or part of the Japanese, interact with the Japanese people. And so the idea, I think, for both of these is that it's meant to be good for morale, that it's meant to be good to feel comfortable at home, and it's meant to be good to be comfortable outside, because both of these are meant to mitigate the kind of culture shock that could affect people's ability to do their jobs.
So you've alluded to this a little bit, and I want to get into it a little more now. you've mentioned in your research that American soldiers at these bases are shown films which discuss Japanese culture, norms, including what's acceptable, what's not in Japanese society. What are some specific examples of what is discussed in these films? And can you talk about, as you mentioned, that some of these films are problematic? So can you talk about in what way they're problematic?
Sure. So it's actually not films. For the most part, it's actual living Japanese people who work on the base, and their job is cultural instruction. And so they put together orientations. So the orientations cover things like Japanese history, Japanese etiquette, how to order in restaurants, how to use chopsticks, differences between driving in the US and in Japan. And a lot of times they'll cover things like interesting places to visit in Japan, or what are the popular sports in Japan, some things like that. So a lot of it is just kind of like a welcome to Japan presentation. But it's often billed as intercultural communication. And I find that that's what's really lacking, is it doesn't really talk about Japanese people most of the time and about how to relate to them. And when it does come up, it comes up in a sense of like, if you're lost, don't panic, just find a Japanese person and they will help you. And the kind of language they use of like, oh, all Japanese people speak English, they're just shy. And if you find someone, they will help you and they'll be happy to help you, encourages a sense of entitlement, an expectation that Japanese people will do what you want if you push them hard enough, which is a very problematic assertion, I think, for people who are trying to live and communicate in a foreign country. It's also problematic in that a lot of what's taught, I think, is catered to either, on the one hand, the soldiers' expectations. So there's a lot about things like ninja and robots and Hello Kitty and anime. Or it's catered to these kind of cultural myths that a lot of Japanese people subscribe to, that have a kind of nationalist bent to them about Japan being the most unique country and Japan being impossible for foreigners to fully comprehend. And from a social science perspective, both of these are problematic because they're both kind of imaginary Japans that don't really overlap with everyday experience or help people to interact and understand the people that they're meeting.
I want to go into something that's not directly related to your research, but I think that there's some overlap here. There's been a push, especially in recent years, by conservatives in the Japanese government and people with a lot of nationalist fervor just in everyday society, to remove Article 9 from the Japanese Constitution, which, as you had briefly spoken about earlier on in the podcast, is a provision in the Japanese Constitution that prevents them from having a standing military. With the seemingly tightly intertwined connection between military bases and Japanese society, just how ingrained these bases now seem to be in Japan, is it reasonable to suspect that the US military would depart from Japan anytime soon? Or is that more of just a fleeting wish list by some of these more conservative leaning people in Japanese society?
There's a couple of interesting things about that. One is that the US government has off and on for a very long time been supportive of Japan changing or getting rid of Article 9 in order to rearm. Because that creates a new source of potential allies and potential ground troops when the U.S. feels that it needs to perform a military action in Asia. So that's been the U.S.'s goal almost since the end of the occupation, in fact. But interestingly, the Japanese conservatives, in general, the ones that want to get rid of Article 9, are the same ones that are very supportive of the U.S.-Japan relationship and of the bases. So they aren't talking about getting rid of the US bases. They're just talking about changing Japan to a fully militarized country so that they can gain the kind of national prestige that comes with things like being on the UN Security Council or taking part in anti-terrorist operations overseas. And there's a lot, I think, of Japanese masculinity culture wrapped up in this. There are theorists who talk about ideas that for some Japanese leaders, Article 9 was experienced as a kind of emasculation of the nation. And so it's like reclaiming the nation's masculinity by rearming. So there's a lot of ideological work behind it too, but it's not really focused on the US leaving. And as I mentioned earlier, it's standard military logic that once you have a position, you never let it go. So the US, I think, would be very strongly opposed to any suggestion from the Japanese government that they should leave. But the Japanese government, I don't think, particularly under the conservatives, would ever make that suggestion. They often, I think, see the US as enemies or perceived enemies as their enemies as well. And so, if anything, it's almost better to have the US there to fight wars so that they don't have to, even if they have the capability.
Before we wrap up, one question that I like to ask a lot of guests is, obviously you've spent a lot of time researching this topic and you're familiar with the literature. If someone's listening to this episode and they think to themselves, man, I really want to know more about the history of Japanese military bases the history of American military bases in Japan, what would be one or two books that you would recommend someone read?
So there are a couple of books that I really like in terms of learning about the US occupation of Japan. Neither one is a straightforward history of the occupation. They're both kind of looking at kind of interesting sides of the occupation or developments between the occupation and now and how they relate to US military bases. One is Gerald Figal's Beachheads, War, Peace, and Tourism in Post-War Okinawa, which starts with the occupation of Okinawa, which lasted 20 years longer, in fact, than the occupation of the rest of Japan, and then talks about its transition from being this military island to a tourist destination and how the military undertones persisted and shaped that. Another one that I really like is by Jolyon Baraka Thomas. It's called Faking Liberties, Religious Freedom in American Occupied Japan. It's won some prestigious awards, and it's just a really interesting look at that particular aspect and looking at the occupation as a democratization project and how that actually unfolded.
Carl, thank you for coming on this episode of the What is Asia podcast.
Sure, thank you so much. I'm so glad to be here.
And for those who want to see more content, you can go to the What is Asia podcast YouTube channel or nakotadefonza.com. We'll see you in the next episode.